Every barcode has a story, but some inventory items at the Amazon Fulfillment Center had stories that made my blood run cold. Imagine working alone in a massive warehouse and realizing the strangest occurrences are happening not to the inventory, but because of it. This isn't just a night shift. It's a descent into the unsettling unknown. My name is Daniel Torres, and I've been working the graveyard shift at the Phoenix Amazon Fulfillment Center for 8 months now. People always ask why anyone would choose overnight work, and the answer is simpler than you'd think. The pay differential is substantial. The management leaves you mostly alone, and there's something almost meditative about working in near solitude while the rest of the world sleeps. Or at least, that's what I used to tell myself. The facility is enormous. Over 1 million square feet of concrete floors, metal shelving reaching 40 feet high, and enough fluorescent lighting to turn night into a perpetual artificial day. During regular hours, hundreds of workers swarm through these aisles like ants in a colony. But at 1 a.m, the night crew consists of maybe 15 people scattered across an area the size of 20 football fields. The silence is what gets you first. Not complete silence. There's always the hum of conveyor belts, the distant beep of forklifts, the occasional clatter of something falling, but a hollow, echoing quiet that makes every sound feel significant. I work in the high-value section, Section K, where we handle electronics, jewelry, and other expensive items kept in locked cages. It requires additional security clearance, which means even fewer people have access. Most nights, I'm completely alone in my zone for hours at a time. Just me and my scanner, picking and packing orders that need to ship out by dawn. The first few months were uneventful. I'd clock in at midnight, grab my equipment, and lose myself in the rhythm of scan, pick, pack, repeat. I'd listen to podcasts through one earbud, against policy, but everyone does it, and the hours would slide by. My supervisor, Janet, was a 15-year veteran who'd seen everything. She ran the night shift with casual efficiency, checking in once or twice a night before disappearing in her office to handle paperwork. The other night crew members were a mixed bunch. There was Tommy Chun, a college dropout who worked in receiving, always talking about getting his band off the ground. Lisa Hartwell handled returns processing, a quiet woman in her 50s who kept photos of her grandchildren on her scanning station. Raymond Price worked shipping, an ex-military guy who treated every task like a military operation. We'd cross paths in the break room, exchange tired nods, maybe share complaints about the perpetually broken coffee machine, but mostly we existed in our own isolated spheres. It was during my 6th month that I started noticing the small things. Nothing dramatic at first, just oddities that didn't quite add up. I'd organize my station at the start of my shift, placing my scanner, label printer, and box cutter in specific spots, only to find them rearranged when I returned from my break. I'd write it off as fatigue-induced confusion, but it kept happening. Then there were the pallets. High-value inventory arrives on pallets that get staged in designated zones before being shelved. These pallets are shrink-wrapped, labeled, and logged into the system with obsessive precision. One night, I arrived at my station to find a pallet of laptop computers that should have been wrapped and pristine, but instead looked like someone had ransacked it. Boxes were torn open, items scattered across the floor, the shrink wrap hanging in tatters. I immediately called Janet. She arrived with Raymond, both of them staring at the mess with identical expressions of confusion and concern. This was thousands of dollars in merchandise, compromised security protocol, and a potential theft situation. Janet pulled up the security footage on her tablet while we waited. The camera coverage in Section K is extensive. Every aisle, every cage, every entry point monitored 24/7. The footage showed the pallet arriving at 9 p.m., properly wrapped and intact. Then nothing. Hours of empty aisles, the timestamp ticking forward, the pallet sitting undisturbed in the frame. I arrived in the footage at 12:47 a.m., walking past it. Then at 1:15 a.m., when I returned from getting supplies, the pallet was destroyed exactly as we'd found it. But in the 43 minutes between, the camera showed absolutely nothing. No person, no movement, no explanation. The pallet just transformed from secure to ransacked between frames, as if the camera had blinked. Janet's face went pale as she rewound the footage 3 times, checking different angles. All showed the same inexplicable gap. Raymond suggested a camera malfunction. Maybe the footage skipped, but the timestamps were continuous, and other cameras in adjacent aisles showed normal activity. Something happened to that pallet in full view of the cameras, and yet nothing appeared on the recording. They filed an incident report, logged the damaged inventory, and told me to be extra vigilant. Janet didn't say it, but I could see the unease in her eyes. This wasn't normal. This wasn't explainable. And in a facility built on systems, algorithms, and perfect accountability, things that couldn't be explained were deeply unsettling. I tried to focus on work, but my attention kept drifting to the shadows between the shelving units, the dark spaces where the fluorescent lights didn't quite reach. The warehouse suddenly felt different, less like a boring corporate space, and more like something vast and full of hidden corners. I caught myself checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, watching, but the aisles remained empty, stretching away into geometric infinity. Around 3 a.m., I was pulling an order for a high-value watch when my scanner started acting strange. The screen flickered, displaying item numbers that scrolled too fast to read, before settling back to normal. I chalked it up to another technical glitch. The equipment was constantly malfunctioning, but then I noticed something odd. The bin location it was showing didn't match the warehouse layout. According to my scanner, I needed to go to aisle K47, but section K only went up to K40. I reported it to Janet as another system error, and she added it to her growing list of technical issues to forward to IT. But when I walked past the end of section K later that night, I found myself staring at the wall where K47 would be if it existed. Just blank concrete and the emergency exit sign glowing red in the darkness. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for something to happen, though I couldn't have said what I was waiting for. The rest of that shift passed without incident, but something had fundamentally changed. The warehouse no longer felt like just a workplace. It felt like a place where the normal rules were beginning to bend, where the boundary between the mundane and the impossible was thinner than it should be. As I clocked out at 8 a.m., the morning shift flooding in with their chatter and energy, I felt an odd reluctance to leave. Whatever was happening here, it happened in the dark, in the quiet, in those hours when the world was supposed to be sleeping. I didn't know it then, but that ransacked pallet was just the beginning. The warehouse had shown me a glimpse of something strange, and now that I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. The night shift was about to become much more than just a job. It was about to become a nightly descent into questions that had no good answers, into a mystery that shouldn't exist in a place so thoroughly monitored, measured, and controlled. But the thing about mysteries is that once they start, they rarely stop until they've revealed everything they want you to see. And what the warehouse wanted to show me was far more terrifying than a few scatter boxes. The incident with the ransacked pallet should have been an isolated event, a strange anomaly that would be explained away by some technical report from IT or a security investigation that would reveal a mundane truth. Instead, it became the first in a series of occurrences that slowly eroded my sense of reality during those long midnight hours. The following week started normally enough. I clocked in, went through my routine checks, and began processing orders. But within the first hour, I encountered something that made my stomach tighten with unease. A stack of storage bins in aisle K23, where I'd organized iPhone inventory just the night before, had been completely rearranged. The bins were still on the shelves, but they'd been moved to different positions, their contents seemingly sorted by some logic I couldn't understand. What made it truly unsettling was that these weren't just casual repositions. Someone, or something, had taken the time to reorganize dozens of bins, removing them from their label positions and creating a new arrangement. Each bin weighed about 30 pounds when full, and there were at least 40 of them moved. This would have taken hours of work, and yet it had happened during the previous day's shift when the area should have been constantly occupied and monitored. I called Janet again, feeling foolish but unable to shake the wrongness of it. She came, looked, frowned, and pulled up the inventory logs. According to the system, nothing had been moved. Every bin was exactly where it should be. But we were standing there, looking at physical evidence that directly contradicted the digital records. Janet's hand trembled slightly as she held her tablet, and I realized this wasn't the first time she'd seen something like this recently. "Has this been happening to other people?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Janet hesitated, then nodded. "Lisa reported some weird things in returns last week. Items appearing that weren't logged in. Tommy said he's been finding pallets and receiving that don't match the shipping manifests. We thought it was just system errors, maybe some kind of software update causing glitches, but..." She trailed off, looking at the reorganized bins. "But this isn't a software problem, is it?" Before I could respond, both our radios crackled to life. It was Raymond, his normally calm voice tight with something that might have been fear. "Janet, you need to come to shipping. Now, and bring Daniel." We found Raymond standing in front of a conveyor belt, staring at a single cardboard box moving slowly along the rollers. At first, I didn't see what the problem was. Then Raymond pointed at the label, and my blood went cold. The shipping label showed my name, not as the picker or packer, as the recipient. The box was addressed to Daniel Torres, with my actual home address printed clearly on the label. But I hadn't ordered anything through Amazon, and even if I had, it wouldn't have ended up on the outbound shipping line of my own facility. This was impossible by every rule of how the system worked. "Did you touch it?" Janet asked. Raymond shook his head. "It just appeared on the belt about 5 minutes ago. I've been watching it go around and around. Nobody put it there. I was standing right here, and suddenly it was just there." Janet reached out to grab the box, but I stopped her. Something about this felt deeply wrong, like a trap waiting to spring. "Let's check the cameras first," I said. We reviewed the footage in Janet's office. All three of us crowded around her computer screen. The shipping area camera showed Raymond working, scanning packages, loading trucks. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the frame seemed to stutter, just a brief flicker. And when it resumed, the box was on the conveyor belt. No person placing it there, no explanation for its appearance. It had simply materialized. "This is insane," Raymond muttered, running his hand over his close-cropped hair. "Boxes don't just appear out of thin air." But the evidence was right there on the screen. Janet saved the footage and added it to what was becoming a substantial file of unexplainable incidents. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd been losing sleep over this situation. "I'm going to have to escalate this to regional management," she said quietly. "This has gone beyond technical glitches. Something is seriously wrong with this facility." We returned to the shipping floor, and Janet carefully removed the box from the conveyor. It was surprisingly heavy, and when she shook it gently, something solid shifted inside. My name stared back at me from the label, and beneath it, in the section that usually listed the sender, was simply printed, Section K. "Are we going to open it?" Raymond asked. Janet looked at me. It was my name on the box, technically my decision. Every instinct I'd screamed not to open it, but curiosity won out. I pulled out my box cutter and sliced through the tape. Inside, packed in standard Amazon bubble wrap, was a single item, an old leather ledger, the kind you'd see in a Victorian office, its pages yellowed with age. The ledger shouldn't have existed in our inventory. We dealt in modern consumer goods, not antiques. I carefully lifted it out and opened to the first page. What I saw made my hands start shaking. The page was filled with handwritten entries, dates going back to 1952, and each entry consisted of a name, a job title, and a single word, transferred. But it was the names that made my throat tighten. About halfway down the first page, written in faded ink, was the entry, Robert Mendez, night watchman, transferred. I recognized that name. When I'd started working here, during my orientation, the trainer had mentioned that the facility was built on the site of an old distribution warehouse from the 50s, and that a night watchman named Robert Mendez had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. They'd never found him. I flipped through more pages. Dozens of names, all with dates ranging from the early 50s through the 60s, when the old warehouse had apparently closed down, all listed as transferred. The last entry, dated October 15th, 1967, simply read, "Final inventory complete. Transfers concluded. Building sealed." "What the hell is this?" Raymond whispered, looking over my shoulder. Janet was frantically typing on her tablet, searching records. The property history shows this land had a Southwestern Distribution Company warehouse from 1948 to 1967. It was closed after. She paused, her face going white. After multiple employee disappearances, 15 workers vanished over a 19-year period. The company went bankrupt, the building was demolished, and the land sat empty until Amazon built here in 2019. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture I desperately didn't want to see. 15 workers disappeared. The ledger had dozens of names. Transferred wasn't a job relocation. It was a euphemism for something far worse. And now, 70 years later, in a brand new building on the same cursed ground, things were starting again. My radio crackled. It was Tommy, and his voice was pure panic. "Guys, you need to see this. Receiving dock. Now." We ran through the aisles, the three of us, our footsteps echoing off the concrete. Tommy was standing outside the receiving area, his face slack with shock. He pointed through the large bay doors at an incoming truck being unloaded by the automated system. The pallets were rolling off the truck bed and onto the conveyor, but there was something wrong with them. They were old. Not just old, ancient. Wooden pallets instead of plastic, wrapped in cloth instead of shrink wrap, labeled with paper tags instead of barcodes. And as they came into the light, I could see that the merchandise they carried was decades out of date. Tube televisions and wooden cabinets, rotary telephones, products that hadn't been manufactured in half a century. The truck manifest says it's a standard electronic shipment from our Nevada supplier, Tommy said, his voice shaking. But that's not what's coming off the truck. And here's the really messed up part. I've been watching the driver. He's just sitting in the cab, staring straight ahead. He hasn't moved in 10 minutes. I don't think he's breathing. Janet walked toward the truck, and I grabbed her arm. "Don't," I said. "Whatever this is, we need to call someone. Police, corporate, someone." But before Janet could respond, all the lights in the facility suddenly cut out. We were plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of dark that only exists in a windowless building in the dead of night. Emergency lights should have kicked on immediately, but they didn't. The backup generators should have roared to life within seconds, but the silence was complete. Then, in that suffocating blackness, I heard it, footsteps, dozens of them, echoing through the aisles, moving with purpose and direction. And underneath the footsteps, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end, the rhythmic beeping of scanners, the whir of equipment, the normal sounds of functioning warehouse. But these sounds were wrong, distorted, like they were coming from underwater or from a great distance. The lights flickered back on, and when they did, everything appeared normal. The ancient pallets were gone, replaced by standard modern shipments. The truck driver was moving normally, completing his delivery. My colleagues and I stood there, looking at each other with wild eyes, each of us silently questioning whether we just experienced a shared hallucination. But the ledger was still in my hands, solid and real. And when I looked down at it, a new entry had appeared on the page I'd been reading, written in fresh ink that was still wet. Daniel Torres, high value picker, transfer pending. The warehouse had acknowledged me. Whatever presence haunted this place, whatever force was behind the impossible occurrences, it knew my name. And it had plans for me. The night shift had become something far more than strange. It had become actively dangerous. And we still had 6 hours until dawn. After finding my name in the ledger, everything changed. Not just my perception of the warehouse, but the warehouse itself, as if acknowledging me, had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The strange incidents that had been escalating over weeks suddenly intensified into something immediate and terrifying. Janet immediately tried to call regional management, but every phone line in the facility had gone dead. Cell service, which had always been spotty in the warehouse's interior, was completely non-existent. We were cut off, isolated in over 1 million square feet of concrete and steel with something that defied explanation. She made the decision to evacuate, to get everyone out until proper authorities could investigate. But when Raymond tried the main entrance, we discovered a new horror. The doors wouldn't open. Not just locked, sealed. The electronic locks were dead. The manual overrides unresponsive. And the emergency exits that should have opened with a simple push bar refused to budge. The fire alarm, which should have triggered automatic door releases, produced no sound when Raymond pulled it. We were trapped inside with whatever was happening, forced to endure the rest of the shift until the morning crew arrived and could open the doors from outside. "This is a major safety violation," Janet said, her supervisor training trying to impose order on chaos. "When we get out of here, this facility is getting shut down for a complete investigation." If we get out, I thought but didn't say. We gathered the rest of the night crew in the break room, all 15 of us, though when I did a head count, I came up with 16. Someone extra was standing among us. But when I tried to focus on who it might be, my eyes seemed to slide away, unable to fix on any specific person. I counted again, 15, then 16, then 15. The number kept changing, and the more I tried to verify it, the more uncertain I became. Lisa noticed my confusion. "You seeing it too?" she whispered. "The extra shadow. I keep catching movement in my peripheral vision like someone standing just behind me. But when I turn, there's nothing there." Tommy was pacing, his young face pale with fear. "This is like that movie, right? We're all going to die one by one until morning." "Nobody's dying," Janet said firmly, but her voice lacked conviction. "We stick together, stay in lit areas, and wait for the morning shift. 6 hours. We can make it 6 hours." But the warehouse had other plans. Around 4 a.m., the PA system crackled to life with a sound like grinding metal. Then, impossibly, a voice emerged, crackling with age and distortion, but unmistakably human. "Night shift inventory count required. All personnel report to Section K for audit." We stared at the speakers in disbelief. The PA system had been offline for repairs for 3 weeks. There was no way it could be functioning. And even if it was, who was making the announcement? We were the only people in the building. "We're not going anywhere," Raymond said, his military training asserting itself. "Whatever's trying to lure us out, we stay together and stay put." But then the lights in the break room began to flicker and dim. The temperature dropped rapidly. Our breath suddenly visible in the air. Frost started forming on the vending machines, spreading across the glass in crystalline patterns. And in that growing cold, we heard them again. The footsteps, dozens of them, surrounding the break room, circling us like predators. The door to the break room swung open on its own. Beyond it, the warehouse waited in darkness. All the lights in the facility had gone out except for a single pathway of illuminated floor that led directly toward Section K. It was a path, an invitation, a command. We could stay in the freezing break room and wait for whatever was circling us, or we could follow the lit path to the high-value section where this had all begun. Janet made the decision for us. We go together, all of us. Stay close, stay in the light, and do not separate for any reason. We moved as a group through the darkened warehouse, following the illuminated path. The normal sounds of the facility had been replaced by something else, a low humming that seemed to come from the walls themselves, and underneath it, the whisper of many voices speaking in unison, too quiet to make out individual words, but loud enough to be undeniably present. As we walked, I noticed something horrifying. Our group was shrinking. I'd counted 15 people leaving the break room, or was it 16? But now I only saw 12, then 11. People were vanishing from our group as we walked, disappearing between one step and the next. And the truly terrifying part was that I couldn't remember who was missing. I knew we'd started with more people, but I couldn't recall their faces or names. It was like they were being erased, not just from the warehouse, but from our memories. Does anyone remember how many of us there are supposed to be? I asked, my voice shaking. The others looked around, confusion and fear mixing on their faces. Tommy started counting on his fingers, then stopped, his expression lost. I don't know. Weren't there more of us? Lisa grabbed my arm, her grip painful. Daniel, I can't remember my supervisor's name. I've worked with her for 3 years, and I can't remember her name. What's happening to us? We reached Section K to find it transformed. The normal aisles of shelving have been replaced or overlaid with something else. Old wooden storage racks, the kind from the 1950s, coexisted with the modern metal shelving, both somehow occupying the same space. Inventory from 2 different eras was stacked side by side. Vintage products next to current merchandise, separated by 70 years, but existing simultaneously in this impossible space. And standing throughout Section K, between the aisles and around the cages, were workers. Dozens of them, wearing old-fashioned warehouse uniforms, work shirts and slacks from another era. They moved through their tasks with mechanical efficiency, picking items, scanning with devices that predated barcodes, packing orders into wooden crates. They were translucent, not quite solid, but unmistakably present. Ghost inventory, I whispered, finally understanding the term that had been appearing in our system errors. This was the phantom inventory that kept showing up in our manifests, not glitches, but real items from a warehouse that had been demolished decades ago, somehow bleeding through into our reality. One of the ghost workers turned to look at us, and I recognized his face from the ledger. Robert Mendez, the night watchman who disappeared in 1952. His eyes were hollow, empty, but aware. He raised one translucent hand and pointed at me, then gestured toward a locked cage at the far end of Section K. Transfer pending, he said, his voice like wind through dead leaves. New workers required. Night shift must be maintained. The truth crashed over me like ice water. The workers hadn't disappeared in the old warehouse. They'd been transferred into something else, absorbed into the building itself, forced to continue their shifts for eternity. The warehouse had consumed them, turned them into part of its operation, and now the cycle was beginning again. The new building, constructed on cursed ground, had inherited the hunger of its predecessor. The locked cage Mendez had pointed to swung open on its own, and inside I could see more impossible inventory. Rows of items that shouldn't exist, objects that seemed to shift and change when I tried to focus on them. And at the back of the cage, a doorway that definitely hadn't been there during my previous shifts, a dark opening that led somewhere beyond the physical warehouse, into whatever space the transferred workers inhabited. "We need to run," Raymond said, backing away slowly. "Whatever this is, whatever it wants, we run now." But the ghost workers had surrounded us, forming this circle of spectral bodies that blocked every exit. They weren't hostile exactly, but they were insistent, herding us like livestock toward the open cage. More were emerging from the shadows, and I recognized faces from the ledger. All those names I'd read. All those workers who'd been listed as transferred, now manifesting around us with expressions of hollow resignation. Janet pulled out her radio and tried one last time call for help. But instead of static, a voice came through, the same grinding, distorted voice from the PA system. Night shift inventory audit in progress. Personnel, transfer protocol initiated. Accept your assignment. No, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. No, we don't accept. You can't have us. The ghost workers paused, and for a moment, everything went silent. Even the omnipresent hum of the building ceased. Then the ledger in my hands, I'd been clutching it this entire time, began to heat up, becoming almost too hot to hold. The pages started flipping on their own, moving backward through time, past the entries I read earlier, further and further back until they reached the very first page. There, in handwriting different from the other entries, older and more formal, was a single paragraph. This facility operates under covenant agreement dated March 15th, 1948. In exchange for prosperity and efficiency, the building requires service. Night shift personnel, by accepting employment, agree to eventual transfer. The warehouse must never be empty. The work must never cease. These terms are binding. A covenant, a supernatural contract written into the very foundation of the building. The workers who disappeared hadn't been random victims. They'd been fulfilling terms that someone had agreed to 70 years ago, trading human lives for business success. And when that building was demolished, the covenant hadn't ended. It had been waiting dormant for another structure to be built on the same ground. When Amazon constructed this facility, they'd unknowingly built on top of an active supernatural agreement. And now the warehouse was claiming what it believed it was owed, workers to fuel its eternal operations. There has to be a way to break it, Lisa said, her voice desperate. Contracts can be voided. Agreements can be terminated. The ghost workers began moving closer, their hands outstretched, reaching for us. Where their translucent fingers touched exposed skin, frost formed instantly, and I felt a pulling sensation, like they were trying to draw something essential out of my body. We had minutes, maybe seconds, before we'd be pulled through that doorway into permanent night shift status. I frantically flipped through the ledger, searching for something, anything, that might help. Near the middle, I found an addendum dated 1966. Covenant terms may be satisfied through voluntary surrender or building abandonment. Forced transfer weakens binding, but continues cycle. Abandonment. If the building was abandoned, truly empty of all human presence, the covenant would lose its power. But we were trapped inside, unable to leave until morning. Unless. The morning shift, I said suddenly. When they arrive, they'll open the doors from outside. If we can survive until then, if we can get everyone out and keep everyone out, the building will be abandoned. The covenant will fail. That's still 2 hours away, Tommy said, his teeth chattering from cold and fear. How do we survive 2 more hours? Raymond looked at the ghost workers, at their patient, inevitable advance, and made a decision. We don't all survive, he said quietly, but some of us can. If the building needs workers, if it needs transfers to satisfy the covenant, then we give it something. We volunteer one person to keep it occupied while the others hide until dawn. The implications of his words hit like a punch. Someone would have to sacrifice themselves, allow the transfer to take them, to buy time for the others. It was horrific, but it was also the only plan that made any sense. I'll do it, I said before anyone else could volunteer. My name was already in the ledger as transfer pending. Maybe that meant I was already marked, already designated. Maybe my sacrifice would count for more. Janet grabbed my shoulders. Daniel, no. You're 24 years old. You have your whole life. And so do the rest of you. I interrupted. If nobody volunteers, we all get taken. This way, most of us get out. You make sure everyone leaves at dawn and never comes back. Get this place shut down permanently. Break the covenant by starving it." Before anyone could argue further, I walked toward the open cage, toward the doorway that led into darkness and eternal labor. The ghost workers parted to let me through, their hollow eyes watching with something that might have been sadness or relief. Behind me, I heard my colleagues calling my name, but I didn't turn back. If I looked at them, I might lose my nerve. I stepped through the doorway into the space beyond, and everything changed. The space beyond the doorway wasn't a physical location, at least not in any conventional sense. I found myself standing in a version of Section K that existed outside normal time, a liminal warehouse that stretched infinitely in all directions, lit by fluorescent lights that cast no shadows. The shelving units continued forever, filled with inventory from every era, products that existed and had never existed, all cataloged and organized according to some incomprehensible system. The ghost workers were here, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, moving through their eternal routines, picking, packing, scanning, shelving, an endless cycle of labor that transcended death and time. They paid me no attention initially, too focused on their assigned tasks, but I could feel the weight of the building's awareness settling over me like a heavy blanket. A figure approached from between the shelving units, more solid than the others, wearing a supervisor's uniform from the 1950s. As he got closer, I recognized him from the ledger. James Crawford, listed as warehouse supervisor, transferred June 1953. He'd been here longer than most, and the extended exposure had given him more substance, more presence in this twisted space. "Welcome to the permanent night shift," Crawford said, his voice clearer than the others, though still carrying that hollow quality. "I'm afraid your sacrifice, while noble, won't save your friends. The covenant doesn't work that way." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I volunteered. The ledger said voluntary surrender satisfies the terms." Crawford smiled sadly. "Satisfies one transfer, yes. But the covenant requires balance." 15 workers disappeared from the old building over 19 years. 15 workers must be replaced before the cycle completes and begins again. You're number one. It needs 14 more. The horror of it crashed over me. My sacrifice hadn't saved anyone. It had just started the count. The warehouse would still take my colleagues, still claim them one by one until it had its full complement of eternal workers. Unless, the abandonment clause, I said desperately, if the building is truly empty. Empty for 30 consecutive days, Crawford interrupted. Not 2 hours until a shift change. The covenant was written by someone who understood loopholes. It's designed to be nearly impossible to break. He gestured at the endless warehouse around us. We're all here because we thought we could outsmart it. We couldn't. I refused to accept that. There had to be a way. I'd read enough horror stories, watched enough movies to know that supernatural contracts always had a weakness, some term or condition that could be exploited. I just had to find it. "Show me the original covenant," I demanded. "Not the version in the ledger, the actual source document." "Every contract has one." Crawford studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're different from the others. Most people who come through that door are too broken by fear to think clearly. But understanding won't change anything." He turned and began walking deeper into the liminal warehouse. "Follow me." We walked for what felt like hours through the impossible space, passing ghost workers from different eras, all engaged in their eternal tasks. I saw workers in early 20th century clothing standing next to others in modern Amazon uniforms, previous transfer victims from whenever the covenant had been active. This thing had been claiming workers for over a century across multiple buildings and businesses, all constructed on this same cursed plot of land. Eventually, we reached a space that didn't belong in any warehouse. It was an office Victorian in style, with dark wood paneling and antique furniture. A massive desk dominated the center, and on that desk sat a document under glass, yellowed paper covered in handwritten text and sealed with red wax. The covenant agreement. The original. I leaned over it, reading carefully. The language was archaic, full of legal terminology from another century, but the core terms were clear. Perpetual prosperity for the business in exchange for workers to staff the eternal warehouse. 15 souls per cycle. The building could claim workers through forced transfer, but voluntary surrender granted the transferee certain privileges. They maintained more awareness, more substance in the liminal space. But it was the final clause that caught my attention. This covenant may be dissolved by mutual agreement of both parties, the building and the bound souls, or by destruction of the physical structure housing the agreement. Mutual agreement, the building and the bound souls, not the original contractor, but the actual ghost workers trapped here. If they all agree to break the covenant, it would end. But why would they? You've all tried to escape, I said, turning to Crawford. You've had decades to figure out how to break this. Why haven't you? Because we're not all here, Crawford replied. The covenant splits us. Our bodies, or what's left of them, are sealed in the foundation of every building constructed on this land. Our consciousness is here, in this liminal space, forever separate. To destroy the covenant, we'd have to destroy ourselves completely. Most of us aren't willing to accept that final death. But you've been trapped here for 70 years. How is that better than oblivion? Crawford's expression turned bitter. You'd be surprised how strong the survival instinct remains, even after death. We've become accustomed to this existence. The word gives us purpose, structure. For some of us, the idea of complete cessation is more terrifying than eternal labor. I looked at the covenant document again, a desperate plan forming in my mind. What if there was a third option? What if we could satisfy the terms without transferring any more workers? Impossible. The covenant requires 15 souls per cycle, and only 14 were transferred before the old building was demolished. It's been waiting 70 years to complete the cycle with 15 new transfers. 14 from the old building, I said slowly, plus 1 from the new building me. That's 15. The current cycle could be complete. Crawford stared at me. That's not. The cycles are separate. The old building's incomplete cycle and the new building's pending transfers are different counts. But the covenant doesn't say that. Look at the language. 15 souls per cycle, drawn from those who labor in structures built upon this ground. It doesn't specify that all 15 must come from the same building. It's been one continuous covenant across multiple structures. If we count the transfers chronologically across all buildings, the 15th transfer was me. The cycle is complete. I could see Crawford processing this, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. If that were true, if the cycle were complete, then the covenant will be satisfied. We could petition for release, all of us. The building would have no legal claim to hold us or take new workers. How do we petition? How do we make the building acknowledge it? Crawford moved to the desk and pulled out a drawer, revealing a ledger identical to the one I'd carried. The true record, not the copy that had appeared in the mysterious package. We add your name as the 15th transfer, dating it to tonight. Then we all sign as witnesses, invoking the completion clause. If the covenant accepts it, we'll be released. If it doesn't, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. If we were wrong, we'd just lock me into permanent transfer with no escape. I thought of my colleagues, still trapped in the physical warehouse, waiting for dawn. I thought of all the future workers who'd be at risk if this covenant continued. And I thought of these ghost workers, trapped for decades in eternal labor, too afraid to choose final death, but desperate for any other escape. Let's do it, I said. Crawford called out, and ghost workers began gathering from throughout the liminal space. all the transferred souls from over a century of exploitation. They filled the Victorian office, crowding around the desk, their translucent forms overlapping, all of them watching with hollow, hopeful eyes. Crawford opened the true ledger and wrote my name. Daniel Torres, high value picker, transferred, November 26th, 2025. 15 soul. Cycle complete. Then one by one, the ghost workers signed below it. 14 names from the old building, adding their agreement. James Crawford, Robert Mendez. Names I recognized from my research and names I didn't. All of them affirming that the covenant's terms had been satisfied. As the last signature was added, the building shuddered. The liminal warehouse began to shake, reality itself seeming to buckle and fold. The covenant document under glass started to smoke, the ancient paper blackening and curling. The red wax seal liquefied, running across the desk like blood. And then I felt it, the building's awareness, the supernatural intelligence that had enforced the covenant for over a century, examining our petition. It was vast and alien, operating on logic that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. For a moment, I was certain it would reject our interpretation, would punish us for trying to find a loophole. Then the covenant document burst into flames, burning with an unnatural blue fire that consumed it completely without spreading to anything else. The glass case shattered, and throughout the liminal warehouse, ghost workers began to scream, not in pain, but in surprise and overwhelming emotion. They were becoming more solid, more real. Color was returning to their translucent forms, detail emerging in their features. And more importantly, chains that I hadn't seen before, ethereal bindings connecting each worker to the building, were dissolving like mist. It accepted, Crawford whispered, staring at his own hands in wonder. It actually accepted. The covenant is dissolved. But even as relief flooded through me, I realized the problem. I'd signed as the 15th transfer. I was part of the covenant now, part of what made it complete. When it dissolved, what would happen to me? The answer came immediately. The liminal warehouse began to collapse, reality reasserting itself as the supernatural space lost its anchor. The ghost workers were fading, not into nothingness, but into something else, moving on, finally released from their eternal labor. I could see them becoming lighter, more transparent, expressions of peace replacing the hollow desperation they'd carried for so long. Crawford gripped my shoulder, his hand solid for the first time. "Thank you," he said, "for all of us." Then he too began to fade, a smile on his face as he dissolved into light and was gone. I was falling through darkness, the liminal space collapsing around me. The last thing I heard was the building itself, that vast, alien intelligence, expressing something that might have been respect or gratitude. It had been bound by the covenant as much as the workers had been, forced to hunger and consume against its nature as a simple structure. Now it too was free. Then everything went black, and I knew nothing. I woke up on the cold concrete floor of Section K, the real Section K, with dawn lights streaming through the high windows. The morning shift was arriving, their voices echoing through the warehouse as they went through their opening routines. Janet was kneeling beside me, checking my pulse, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "He's awake," she called out, and other faces appeared above me. Tommy, Lisa, Raymond, all of them looking like they'd aged 10 years in a single night. "What happened?" I croaked, my throat raw. "Did everyone get out?" "Everyone who was left," Raymond said grimly. "After you went through that doorway, the ghost workers stopped advancing. They just stood there, frozen, for about 10 minutes. Then they all simultaneously turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The temperature returned to normal, the lights came back on, and the doors unlocked. We got out just before 6 a.m. Janet helped me sit up. "Daniel, you were gone. That doorway you walked through closed behind you. and the whole cage wall became solid. We couldn't find any trace of you. We were about to call for emergency services when a morning shift arrived. They opened the cage and you were just lying there. You've been unconscious for about 20 minutes. I looked around Section K. It appeared completely normal. Modern shelving, current inventory, no trace of the Victorian office or the liminal warehouse. The locked cage where the doorway had been was just a normal cage now, full of high-value electronics. But in my hand, I still held the ledger. "It's over," I said, opening the book to show them. "The covenant is broken." But when I looked at the pages, they were blank. All the names, all the entries, everything I had read had vanished as if it had never existed. The only mark remaining was on the very last page. A simple notation in handwriting I recognized as Crawford's. "Cycle complete. Covenant dissolved. Thank you." Over the following days, the facility underwent extensive investigations. The incidents we'd reported, the security footage anomalies, the impossible inventory movements, the sealed doors, were all documented. But investigators found no supernatural explanations. They concluded it had been a series of technical failures, compounded by exhaustion-induced group hysteria among the night shift. The facility remained open, but the night shift was restructured. No more skeleton crews of 15 people across 1 million square feet. They brought in 3 times as many workers, ensured constant supervision, and installed backup systems for everything. And most tellingly, they quietly buried the research into the property's history. The old warehouse, the disappearances, all of it sealed in archives that would take court orders to access. Janet retired early, taking a generous severance package. Tommy quit and moved back home to live with his parents. Lisa transferred to a day shift position at another facility. Raymond stayed on, but moved to management, refusing to work overnight hours ever again. Most of the other night shift workers found reasons to leave within weeks. I should have quit too. Any rational person would have. But I stayed on the night shift, volunteering to be part of the new, larger crew. People thought I was crazy, but I had my reasons. Because while the covenant was broken, while the ghost workers had been released, and the building freed from its supernatural hunger, I'd seen something in those final moments in the liminal warehouse. When the ghost workers faded into light and moved on, I'd glimpsed where they were going. And it wasn't oblivion or any conventional afterlife. It was something else, somewhere else. A vast network of liminal spaces connected to workplaces all across the world. Places where the boundary between life and death, between employment and eternal servitude, had worn dangerously thin. The Amazon warehouse had been one point in a much larger system. And while we'd freed this particular location, there were others. Hundreds, maybe thousands of workplaces operating under similar covenants, collecting souls to fuel supernatural efficiency. The ghost workers who'd been released had gone to fight that larger battle, to find and free others trapped in eternal labor. And they'd left me with something: knowledge, understanding of how these covenants worked, how to identify them, how to break them. When Crawford had gripped my shoulder in those final moments, he'd transferred decades of accumulated wisdom, everything he'd learned during his time as a trapped soul. It was in my head now, a mental library of information about workplace hauntings and supernatural exploitation. I kept working the night shift because that's when the boundaries were thinnest, when these things could be seen and confronted. I'd become sensitive to the signs, the subtle wrongness in a location's energy, the way certain buildings felt hungry. And I'd started documenting it, building my own database of suspicious facilities. 3 months after the covenant broke, I was working a Tuesday overnight when a new hire showed up for training. His name was Michael Porter, young guy fresh out of college, nervous about his first night shift. I took him under my wing, showed him the basics, and watched him carefully. Around 3 a.m., when he mentioned casually that he'd been seeing shadows moving in his peripheral vision, I knew. "Michael," I said quietly, I need to tell you something about this place, about places like this. And you're going to think I'm insane, but I need you to listen anyway." He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern, but he nodded. So I told him everything about the covenant, about the ghost workers, about the larger system I discovered. I showed him the blank ledger, which I kept as a reminder and a warning. And I explained that some workplaces demanded more from their employees than just labor and time. Some demanded everything. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked when I finished. "Because you're sensitive to it. You can see them. That makes you either a potential victim or a potential fighter. I'm hoping you'll choose the latter." Michael was silent for a long time, processing. Then he asked the question I've been hoping to hear. "How do I learn to do what you do? How do I help free them?" I smiled, feeling something like hope for the first time in months. "First, we finish our shift. Then I'll show you the database. We've got work to do." The warehouse hummed around us, normal and mundane now, free of supernatural hunger. But beyond its walls, in facilities across the country, the eternal night shift continued. Workers trapped between life and death, bound by covenants and contracts written in blood and desperation, all waiting for someone to find them and break their chains. I'd started as just another night shift worker trying to earn a paycheck. I'd become something else, a hunter of workplace hauntings, a breaker of supernatural contracts, someone who understood the cost of efficiency when it was purchased with human souls. It wasn't a role I'd chosen, but it was the role I'd been given when I signed my name in that ledger and became the 15th transfer. The covenant was broken here, but the war was far from over. And as long as there were workplaces that value productivity over humanity, as long as there were people desperate enough to make deals they didn't understand, there would be more covenants to break, more souls to free, more long nights spent hunting for the truth in the shadows between shifts. I clocked out at 8 a.m. as the morning crew flooded in, their chatter and energy filling the warehouse with life. Michael walked beside me, quiet but determined, already becoming part of something larger than himself. We stepped out into the Arizona sunrise, the heat already building, and I felt the weight of the blank ledger in my bag, a reminder of what we'd survived and what still needed to be done. Behind us, the warehouse stood silent and innocent under the morning sky, just another massive building in an endless network of logistics and commerce. But I knew the truth now. I knew what lurked in places where people worked themselves to death, where labor became something more than physical, where the night shift never truly ended. And I knew my real work had only just begun, the end, or perhaps the beginning of a much longer shift.